for a microphone. And so, yeah, we'll just get started. The first talk is on playful human-food interaction research, the state of the art and future directions, presented by Ferran Altariba Perchan. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, hello everyone. My name is Ferran, as he said, and today I'll talk about the paper that I co-authored with my colleague Danielle, who's actually in the audience, so feel free to reach out to her if you want to talk about this during the conference, but also Erno and Catherine. And our paper is a review of the current state of playful human-food interaction research. And for those who haven't heard much about it, human-food interaction, or HFI as we talk about it, is the research space that explores the intersection between food, human interaction, and many times technology. A few months ago at CHI, we presented a study of the state of human food interaction research as a whole. In that study, we saw that this emerging field is super heterogeneous and that it's growing very rapidly. And because of that, we argue that there's a need of ongoing sense-making, both of HFI as a whole, but also of its multiple areas of interest. So that's what we decided to do in this paper, making sense of one of the main subsets of HFI research. In particular, we looked at those works that use play and game-inspired strategies to enhance our interactions with food. We call this subset playful HFI. There are a number of previous works that in different ways have explored this space before. For example, last year at this very same conference, Chisek et al. Coined the term gastrobiology, and they reviewed technologies that enhance eating and drinking in playful ways. Similarly, recent work by Miller et al. Has proposed strategies for designing playful eating technology, and we ourselves have also explored this intersection between play and eating, in this case reviewing the state of playfulness in fine dining restaurants. Though interesting and relevant, all of those works share one common limitation, which is that they mostly focus on food consumption, just one between the many areas of food lives that we're concerned with. The concept of celebratory technology does overcome that limitation because it proposes alternative and more experience-focused directions for human interaction in, but also beyond eating and drinking. However, that work is not necessarily a comprehensive review, but more of a mapping out of design opportunities, and most importantly, it doesn't focus on play per se, but more on experience in a general sense. So long story short, we couldn't really find a comprehensive review of playful human interaction research, and that's why we decided to conduct one. And we began by collecting papers, and we ended up with a data set of 34 publications of very different kinds. Here you can see a summary of what we got. And then we developed a conceptual model to analyze the data to make sense of what we were observing. And we built on four main criteria. First, we built on our previous study, the conceptual model of our previous study of human interaction that we presented at CHI a few months ago. Second, we drew from existing theories of play and game design. You can see some of them on the screen. We also looked at the criteria that previous people who did play-related reviews of HCI used. And we finally looked at the papers in the dataset and identified some additional coding criteria. And based on all of those inputs, we built our conceptual model, our framework. And as you can see, it has three dimensions of analysis: metadata, human food interaction lenses, and play-related concepts. And each of those dimensions is subdivided in a series of lenses that we used as criteria to examine the papers. I'll describe those criteria now. Let's first have a look at the metadata. This is kind of the easy one. Here we looked at basic stuff like publication date, value, type of publication, authors, keywords. In terms of human food interaction lenses, we focused on three main criteria. First, we look at the interplay between the human and the technology and where the agency is placed on that continuum. We also looked at the focus of the research to see what are the motivations behind it, expressed as a continuum again, in this case between functionality, individual experience, and social bonding. And finally, we looked at the areas of food practice explored by the research, which we call domains, including sourcing, storing, producing, eating, tracking, speculating, and reflecting on food. Finally, the third dimension of our model looked at the play-related concepts. It's a review of play or HFI. And here first we looked at the structure of the play experience. We examined the interventions to see whether they were governed by rules or not, if those rules were robust or more loose, and more generally to see whether the interventions afforded experience that were more constrained or open-ended. Second, we looked at the situatedness. We asked ourselves if and in what ways the playful experiences were meant to actually intertwine with the situated food practice, and trying to understand better this connection between the actual situated food practice and the play activity. And finally, we looked also at types of play experience or explored in the research. And here we looked at areas in the PEX framework that I'm sure that many of you will know about, as our granular experiential qualities. But to make them more approachable, we clustered them thematically into 5 higher level types of fun that we call experiential measures. So this is the model that we use to analyze the playful HFI populations on our data set, and I invite you to read the paper if you'd like more details or to ask questions afterwards. Let me now go to the results to give an overview of what we found. When looking at the metadata, we found that there's a progressive increase in publications per year, which actually matches the trend that we found in our previous study of HFI as a whole. We also saw that a lot of publications in the dataset are partially but not fully developed, either because they lack a robust validation mechanism, such as the user study, or because they do not really present novel or significant or clear findings. So we saw a lot of work in progress, for example, that didn't end up including the full study. When looking at the human food interaction criteria, we found the remarkable dominance of eating and drinking over other domains of food practice, as you can see in the graph. We also saw that most publications either give agency to the human or propose balanced agency between humans and technology, which is actually pretty different from what we found in our earlier study of human food interaction as a whole, where we saw clear tendency towards technology automation. And when looking at the focus of the research, we saw that there's a dominance of publications whose goal is to support utilitarian agendas like teaching people how to have more healthy eating habits, etc., etc. Let's now look at our findings related to play concepts. When looking at the types of play structure, we saw that game-related structures with robust rule sets and boundaries are kind of more common than those that use open-ended play and playfulness. And in terms of situatedness, we saw a pretty equal balance between automatic worlds and situated play activities. So there was a nice balance here. But in terms of experiential qualities, we saw clear dominance of hard fun, that is playful experiences that are based on competition, challenge, thrill, and similar experiences, which are actually types of play that we often find in mainstream video games. And based on those results, I would like to highlight a couple of things, a couple of points that we think can help understand where we are right now, playful interaction. The first one is that we saw that there's a clear focus on eating and drinking, with little consideration of other food domains. We also found a dominant focus on utilitarian agendas, sometimes to the detriment of supporting the experience and social bonding. We saw that playful HFI interventions tend to promote user empowerment as opposed to technology automation, which is actually a remarkable difference with HFI research as a whole. We found that playful HFI works often use game-like structures with clear and robust rule sets, and tend to focus on affording experiences of hard fun. There's a lot of emphasis on those experiential qualities that I mentioned before, like competition, challenge, task completion, or thrill. And finally, on a more general level, we saw that almost half of playful HFI publications are not fully developed research, which is something that as a community we may want to reflect on. Extending recent calls for more critical approaches in HFI, we see a need for exploring more thoroughly the social, cultural implications of amending food practices with playful technology. Based on this landscape that we observed, in the paper we propose a series of opportunities for moving forward for future playful HFI research. Here today I will highlight 3 of them that we find particularly important, but please check the paper for more. First, it's pretty clear that we as a community need to start looking beyond eating and drinking to explore how play and playfulness can add value in other areas of our food lives, such as cooking, growing, buying foods, etc. Second, we argue that there's too much focus on the utilitarian potential of play to solve problems. They can motivate us to eat better, to be more safe when we prepare the food, to learn healthier habits. Yes, but that's not all it can do. Play can also make us happier, bring us joy, help us connect with others, and while recent works in this space are starting to push for this agenda, our review shows that they are still in the minority. So we argue that playful HFI could explore more the social, the emotional, the cultural potential of play, at least as much as it explores its capacity to support utilitarian agendas. And finally, we argue that there's a need for embracing the diversity of play and playfulness mean. We've seen a lot of works that propose a very specific kind of play experience, similar to that of stereotypical hard fun-based games. But given the diverse, messy, situated, highly material nature of food practices, we encourage designers and researchers to actually go beyond that to explore a broader blend of play experiences, but also structures. In a way, we will to do this because we think that will make us more likely to design technologies that respond to the playful cravings of not only just a narrow set of player types, but to a broader set of of people and users. And that's all from me today. Thanks for your time and feel free to shoot questions.
Any questions?
Hello, Floyd Müller, Vision Games Lab, I'm at Team Melbourne, Australia. Thanks so much for your talk. I kind of, you mentioned several times, so the playful community did this and this and this, unlike our previous work where we looked at human food interaction in general. Did I hear kind of an undertone that the play community understands food better than the HDI community?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Danielle White, SDU on that co-first author. You can understand many things from what we're saying, but no, I don't believe our data does not suggest that the play community understands food better in any way whatsoever. In fact, the gaps show that the play community has a very limited understanding of the potential of food, because we eat for a lot of reasons. We eat to survive, to live, and for our physiological well-being, but we also eat for social reasons and for cultural reasons and to stimulate our senses and to enjoy good food and good company. Eating is a very, very complex sociocultural activity, and our data actually demonstrates that the play community who are engaging with HFI have a very, very limited understanding, but that understanding is different. The way it plays out is different to how the human food interaction community across broader spectrums of computer-human interaction understand or act in this space. So if there are no other questions, maybe I'll just say what we hope our study will do is open up opportunities to reflect on what's possible here, but also to reflect on the fact that with the diverse forms of publications in Playful HFI, there's room to really consider what does this mean? Can you pull up the different?
Yeah.
This one. Yeah, so we have such a range of papers, and as we can see in the data sets that we provide, some of them, there are a lot of works that can be considered unresolved from a research perspective. But what this points out is something we found very interesting in terms of an emerging research area. What does it mean that there are a lot of short experiments and works in progress and sort of works that have a very short life in some ways. From a research perspective, there aren't studies, there aren't big studies done, then they could almost be considered a gimmick. What does it mean for an emerging research area? Maybe this is really important and can be given a bit more support. Not necessarily support to develop into more complex research projects, but support to exist as ways of experimenting with where more comprehensive research might go and what directions it might go in. And we found this very, very interesting. And it's also present a bit in HFI, but it's really dramatic in Playful HFI. And I think it shows something that the play-oriented community might reflect on, how we can support and leverage this tendency and use it to perhaps strike out new ways of understanding how research can evolve and emerge and grow and establish itself when new fields are arising. Yeah. Thank you.
So our next talk will be towards understanding the design of playful gustosonic experiences with ice cream, presented by Yang Wang.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yan. I'm today's presenter, and I'm a PhD student in social gives lab at RMIT University, Australia. And today, my topic is about some sounds and also like a playful food. And before we get started, let's play a small game. And would you please, everyone, stop walking or just have a rest and listen carefully to this audio in the next 10 minutes, at least 2 minutes. And based on these sounds, and would you please, everyone, guess what the food is? Cool. And I think this next one is harder. The right answer is dark chocolate. We can hear different sounds when we are eating. For example, we can hear chewing sounds, like for example, like kind of apple sounds of dark chocolate, and to perceive what we eat. But however, most people seem to believe sound is the least important sense when we are eating. Research from psychology teaches us sounds can change our perception of flavors and way of eating. For example, if you get a coffee few minutes ago, and when you hear some high-pitched sounds, you will perceive the sweetness increase. Or if you drink coffee and if you can listen some like a low-pitched sound, you may perceive like bitterness than you. So this is our sounds can help us understand this. And these links between the act of eating and listening with the combined multisensory are referred to gastrosonic experiences. And we believe this kind of links offer us rich source for designing playful food experiences. And thanks to the interactive technology today, we can combine the interactive technology with food to support positive relationship with food and enrich our eating experiences. And we believe that designing interactive technology with food should focusing more on experiential aspects. Like previous present, like we should focusing more on playful aspects of eating. And so if we can combine interactive technology with food and sound together to design playful gastrosonic experiences. To explore this, we design ice cream. Sorry.
We designed ice cream. Ice cream.
Sorry, there's some technical problems.
We designed ice cream. Ice cream is a novel capacitive sensing ice cream cone that plays different sounds making the ice cream in order to support our. We designed ice cream and facilitate ice cream relationship. Novel capacitive sensing ice cream cone that plays different sounds making the ice cream in order to support our playful eating experience and facilitate a positive relationship with food. We studied how players explore inventory interaction possibilities with their eating actions, while the different sounds in turn modify those eating actions.
Very rude ice cream, not perfect idea.
The knowledge gained from ice cream can be used to create novel playful eating experiences. It might also be useful when aiming to create
So
meaning
sorry about this.
that people might actually enjoy.
Much about my food. I think normally the ice cream would just wolf it down.
Knowing my friends, we'd make it into a game. And it's also delicious.
Sort of, I guess, encourage you to eat certain foods. So let's say foods that you don't normally would want to eat. With interesting sounds, it might actually appeal to you to actually want to try and eat more.
We can describe how interactive technology can support relations with food, which is a key strategy for mindful eating that advocates an enjoyable relationship with food in order to promote mindful eating. We design ice cream.
So sorry about this. Okay, let me pick.
We design ice cream. Ice cream is a novel capacitated sense of ice cream that plays different sounds when eating ice cream in order to support a playful eating experience and facilitate a positive relationship with food. We study how players explore the different auditory interaction possibilities with their eating actions, while the different sounds in turn modify those eating actions.
Very rude ice cream, not the thing I do.
The knowledge gained from ice cream can be used to create novel, playful eating experiences. It might also be useful when aiming to create eating interventions that people might actually enjoy. Aligning with the idea of mindful eating that promotes a positive relationship with food.
I've never had an experience like that and maybe, I suppose, care so much about my food. I think normally the ice cream would just wolf it down.
Knowing my friends, we'd make it into a game. And it's also delicious because ice cream.
I think it can sort of, I guess, encourage you to eat certain foods. So let's say foods that you don't normally would want to eat. With interesting sounds, it might actually appeal to you to actually want to try and eat more.
With our work, we demonstrate how interactive technology can be used to draw attention to the food, which is a key strategy for mindful eating that advocates an enjoyable relationship with food in order to prevent mindless eating.
Here's our video, and sorry about some technical problems. So here's the ice cream, and the ice cream is a capacitance sensing hall, dynamically generate 4 different playful sounds while eating ice cream. We use ice cream because it's normally dynamic change texture, and eating ice cream as a one type of everyday activities, which can increase our happiness and well-being. So if you want more technical details about how to design this ice cream, please find more details in our paper. And based on 4 dimensions of playfulness proposed by Bopper, we choose 4 playful sounds to express each dimension of playfulness. We use the rolling sounds, facilitate simulation experiences of playfulness. Using conscious sounds to facilitate pragmatic experiences of playfulness. The music sound is for momentary experiences of playfulness, and we also use burping sounds to facilitate uncomfortable experiences of playfulness. We conduct a lab-based study with 32 participants, and we also do semi-structured interview to collect data from the interviews. And we use the semantic analysis approach to analysis data and to generate two themes with 6 findings each. And we also present 4 design tactics for designers. Here is our findings, whole findings and whole things from our data. And through our study, we found there is ongoing interaction loops here. And that means player explore sound through their eating, explore the different auditory interaction possibilities with their eating action, while the sounds in turn modify those interactions. For eating actions, facilitate exploration of sounds, player quotes, I tried different way of eating, such as licking, biting, ice cream to explore the relationship between eating actions and sounds. And for those part like sounds modify eating actions, player also comment, like it was interesting to change my eating speed by playing with the sounds. I like the funny burping sounds, so I make it slower to have some fun. And based on the findings, and we conduct, we found with we propose the four tactics for designer. Here, due to the time limit, we present one for each. So for the eating actions, explore sounds, and we recommend designers to think of the inherent features of food for exploration of the sound from eating. For example, in ice cream, we use the inherent conductive sensing, conductive feature of ice cream, and its dynamic texture. And as ice cream was merging over time, a player had to consistently engage with ice cream. So after each leap, the shape of ice cream was changed, and hence sounds different. And while for the sound facilitated the eating actions, we suggest the designer should think about different kind of sound parameters, like sound resource, sound pinch, and sound qualities. And based on these sound qualities, players may use their different way to explore, based on these sounds, the player may change their eating behaviors. Like, for example, in our study, we use the rolling sounds to simulate, for a simulation experience of playfulness. The player explore opening and closing their mouths as a way to map rolling sound styles while eating ice cream to express their eating actions. So thank you for everyone, and our take-home message. Our take-home message is gastronomic experiences can be a source for play, and if you want to design playful experiences with sounds, please consider this ongoing interaction loop. Thank you for your attention.
I think we have time for maybe one quick question.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, so the design you presented is somewhat limited in terms of the kinds of foods that you can use it with. I mean, you can use it with an ice cream because you have the cone. How would you use it, or how interesting would be to use it with other types of foods, and also maybe with a different demographic, because the playfulness of at least the exaggerated sounds and the whole experience seems to me like it would be something appropriate for children more than adults per se.
Yes, yes, we know that. I think like people here in different with different background, and we got different food culture, and we believe like we just try to use understand the or design interactive technology with food to explore this. And in the future, we might from like people from different field and different area to understand based on their food culture, and we could use this kind of thing. And we also conduct the pilot study. We try out like carrots and the other kind of food. So it's also very interesting. And I think and I believe this kind of design and I demoed this in different place, and the participant give the feedback is very positive, and we believe that kids will love this kind of design, and because it accept the carrots or the other kind of food, and maybe we could design some nutrient food or something based on this kind of design, and then we'll have more fun with the food.
So, yeah, thank you.
So the next talk is unpacking the audio game experience, lessons learned from game veterans, presented by Michael Urbano.
Thank you very much. So welcome, I'm Michael, of TU Wien, Vienna University of Technology, and today I'm presenting you unpacking the audio game experience, lessons learned from game veterans. And my co-author Flora Gyllenkönig is currently in Sweden collecting some mushrooms, but he also wanted me to greet you. So I had a very short talk yesterday for interactivity, so I don't ask the question again. Who of you knows audio games? So I'll just skip to the definition the audiogame.net community provides. So audiogames.net, audio games as opposed to video games or computer games whose main output is sound rather than graphics. And using sound, games can have dimensions of atmosphere and possibilities for gameplay that don't exist with visual alone, as well as providing games far more accessible to people with all levels of sight. So this is the definition of the audiogames.net community, which is the audio games community available. And you have to imagine that on one side, this community mainly consists of people with visual impairments, but on the other side, this community is very passionate about audio game and audio game design, but they're also very disparate. And I will elaborate on that later on. And the thing is, no one asked them before, so no one was going to them before saying, well, why do you care so much about audio games, and what do you think is important about audio games, and what do you think are good and bad audio games, and how do you actually design and develop audio games? So what we did is we wanted to gain an in-depth understanding of the audio game experience and challenges in designing such games. And from an epistemological perspective, of all the constructivist ground theory approach of pajamas to understand how these expert users experience and design audio games. And with these methods, which gave a rise number of concepts and categories, we together capture our theory. So we interviewed 7 members of the audiogames.net community who are visually impaired in mail or Skype. We had 2 iterations, so it was in total 14 interviews. Each lasting from 20 to 135 minutes. So I will now go through the theory we created from the data we collected. So at its core, there is this audio game experience. So it's the overall system that accounts for the participants' experience of audio games. And this is actually what audio games mean to the people who have audio games as part of their lives. And I will also show you some quotes during the presentation. So one of the quotes is, well, market technology is not being used for creating audio games, so we're basically stuck on the 80s and 90s. Or the problem is that audio gamers are easily satisfied with existing audio games because they have no choice. There aren't that much titles available, and many of them never experienced real mainstream gaming. Another quote, I've seen people here in the forum writing that Super Egg was one of the best audio games ever made. Not there is not quality in this game, but seriously, we're talking about a game where the goal is to collect eggs without getting caught by a chicken. So even though this sounds a bit negative, they're very passionate about creating, and they really want to drive this genre and make it better as it is. Another category that we found in our theory is creativity. So they are all non-professionals, but they love to contribute to the community. So they love to write plots, they do coding, they do voice acting, they make music. And for example, one quote is, I'm an actor and a writer, and I'm dealing with plot all the time. I wish to see plots in the games I play. So second category is play, which is also very, very strong related to the audio game experience. So the short answer is to why I play audio games is because I can't play mainstream games, and I'm a kind of a gamer at heart. As I say, the only real options available to me are audio games. I don't have anyone to sit here and read the Final Fantasy script to me and do all the button inputs. So the third category, which is very, very tightly related to audio game experience, is social exchange. So this was a very important motivation for the participants in playing audio games, but also engaging in developing and designing. And of course, gaming and designing can bring people with various backgrounds together if the software is accessible, or when the people and friends can support each other and remove barriers. So this is also a very interesting quote. We went to a friend's house and the whole plan was to just play FIFA. They handed me a controller and they described their moves and they told me what to press. And it was really nice because it was really exciting. Like, I was like, I'm gonna make a goal. And then they were cheering and my friends were like, oh, it's better if we let Justin play and we tell him what to do. It's like more exciting than playing myself. So these inner categories have also some kind of outer bounds that influence how the participant experience audio games and design, but are not that strongly related. So one of the categories is accessibility. Of course, as I mentioned before, people of the community are mainly impaired or blind, and what they do is they mostly come from the mainstream road. Really want to engage with games, so they develop workarounds to still play video games. And also during all these interviews, they were referencing to video games all the time. So also quote, then suddenly mid-90s bang, everything went 3D, and both my spatial abilities with being able to see what's on the screen and the complexity of the images themselves got to be way too much for my level of sight to cope with. And another point of reference here is there are a lot of audio games that have a blind character as protagonist, but the community also says, well, you know, can we just have a game with somebody who happens to be blind who does something else, so that not being blind is a special thing, but I will show you later there's a very clever design strategy to design such a game without having a blind protagonist. So another category is meta tools. So there are tools available to create audio games, but they also say, well, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So none of the major game companies have produced an audio game, but another problem is that the game development tools to create audio games are not the same as that are available for developers with the same amount of resources to create graphical games. And what they also do is they reuse sounds again and again, so you can find the same sounds in many audio games. And they really want also to have some kind of design patterns. The third category is aesthetics. And one of the quotes is, well, some people who are making audio games haven't had the experience of very basic elements of physics in a mainstream game. I mean, things like Super Mario. Mario's walking speed is not constant. Or, for example, most of the audio games that exist are not that appealing because they're very simplistic, like, well, press a button, the sound is in the center. And they also say, well, there is this one audio game I played, which is called Manamon. It's more like a Pokemon ripoff, and I played the first level, and I was kind of shocked because there were so many sounds looping all the time. So there was, for example, a door shutting. And I was like, well, is this the best strategy to sonify an object? And they were like, well, I really don't know, honestly, if we couldn't find a better solution. So these categories also are influenced by the other categories, but we'll go to the next board around it. And there is the availability. So the choices, the audio games that people can select from is very limited. So in the audio game scene, we have so few things to pick from each genre. To play a game, sometimes even it really doesn't have any replayability just because you need to scratch the itch. And we also have a category named innovation, which says, well, I've gotten used to there not really being all that much innovation going on, and the last 30 games that I've played feel all pretty much the same. There's nothing new to them. These also influence them, and then we have the very outer border saying, well, we have the broad appeal, which is how audio games can be made appealing to people from outside the community. And there they say, well, usually when you get sighted people who come to audio games, they tend to have come the root of audio dramas rather than gamers. And which is also very, very sad. It's like audio games are not perceived as, hey, I can play this game, this is really interesting. It's perceived as, wow, I don't have any graphics. So, and this is this clever design strategy I mentioned before. So they say, well, there is a game with a dog, and it tries to attract both audiences. You're playing a dog, and dogs, they can't see very well compared to how they can hear. This is an intelligent way to put a game to the mainstream market without appealing something like, I'm doing a game for the blind, please help me buy the thing. No, you're controlling a dog, and a dog can't see very well, so you're relying on sound. So good luck, this is my game. The last category we found is the mainstream industry. So on the one side, people are always referencing to video games, but on the other side, people are hoping that the tools that the mainstream industry makes available does also help audio game design. And there's a very, very last quote saying, well, I don't know, it's really hard to compare audio games to anything because they can only really be compared to themselves. And even comparing them to early mainstream games is hard because it's kind of a different ballpark. So since I'm running out of time, there are just some points of discussion which you can also find in the paper. But I want to close this presentation with this quote. So the best way to get players with disabilities to play a game is to get them to help you make it. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Hi, Danielle Wild, University of Southern Denmark. This is fantastically interesting work. I just have a very simple question. What percentage of the audio gaming community have been involved in developing games or co-developing games?
It's a very good question, thank you. You can imagine, so there are about 140,000 people registered in the forum, and the forum is available since 2002. But there is one strong core who really thrives all the discussions and is really engaged in designing and creating games. So there are people that are just lurking and looking for tips or hints or something, but there are not that many people really engaging in creating design, unfortunately, because on the one hand, they don't have the skills. So, for example, coding skills, game design skills, sound design skills. And on the other hand, they also don't have that much time because they can't make it professional. There are so many things to consider. For example, what I really want to say is, so there are some developers and designers making audio games and they're void on the audio game market. But then they face issues like piracy in audio games. Piracy, so they're cracking the audio games so that developers can't get any money out of it, which is also badly influencing the community because then they can't do any more audio games. But a very nice strategy this community has evolved is they say, well, if you can't afford an audio game or if you want to crack an audio game, please say so and we buy it for you, which is very interesting. I just wanted to mention that. I hope that I've answered your question.
Thank you, yes. Just a quick comment. I don't know if they connect with the sonic ecology community, but it might be a very, very interesting connection. Sonic ecology is not about games, but it's about sounds.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Bobby van Delden from the University of Twente. Thank you for your talk, really, really interesting. What I was wondering, were there also remarks about equality? So yesterday we were talking about stigmas. Were you also saying something about playing with other people on the same level?
So you mean, what do you mean with playing on the same level?
So if you play an audio game, then the blind person is actually in favor.
Mm-hmm.
And the other way around, of course, if you play something with visuals and visuals, the blind person is in disfavor. Is there anything they were talking about this balance of how they play a game with someone else and who is in favor or not?
Yeah. They clearly state, well, if they play with people who are sighted, if they play together an audio game, people without visual impairments easily lose interest because they can't see anything, so and they're not used to it. But there is, or we suggest that if you did, for example, design an audio game, you should consider doing some graphics on at some kind of cherry on the top of the cake, so that if people who don't have visual impairments don't lose that interest that easily. I hope this answers your question.
So the next talk is going to be interactive soft toys for infants and toddlers, design recommendations for age-appropriate play, presented by Michaela Honauer and Preeta Murthy.
Thank you for the introduction. This is my colleague, Preeta, and my name is Michaela. Did you know that already in 2015, almost 2/3 of the under 3-year-olds in the US daily use a mobile phone? For me as a mother, it's incredible, and you might have a clue how the situation has developed until today. Latest research on families' usage of smartphones and tablets, and the existence of hundreds of apps for the very young children. That all indicates that we cannot prevent the youngest from using technology from early on. However, experts recommend that we don't use technologies at all for the under 4 years old. So what shall we do then? Keep our children in a digital technology lockdown, or shall we buy flashy, noisy, annoying plastic toys? We here address an unexplored research field in HCI. And from our perspective, it's not a question if children at this age should use technologies at all. It's more a question about the quality of interaction and how we can draw back a child's attention to real bodily interaction with toys. We contribute design recommendations for creating more age-appropriate interactive toys for infants and toddlers. So we investigate how to integrate technologies into soft toys and thereby gently introducing children to digital technologies. That's why our research tries to understand how the little ones actually play with soft toys, electronic soft toys, and how to best support the sensory motor experiences at this early stage of infancy. Our methodological approach is characterized by qualitative explorations and a triangulation of evaluation methods. So after an elaborated literature research, we started creating a paper prototype. And we tested it with a few toddlers in our close environment. After getting positive reactions, Preeta created this textile prototype that she's presenting in a few minutes within her master thesis research, and did a more elaborated user study with children. After analyzing the results of the user study, we then conducted in addition 3 expert interviews to frame our insights with a more professional perspective on the topic, and we did in parallel a parental focus group to get the practical implications on the topic. For now, Preeta will present the textile prototype.
So the textile prototype, we have 3 common characters that the children were already familiar with: a fish, a bear, and a firefly. So here you can see a fish in a more water background. When the tail of the fish that is fitted with a stretch sensor is pulled or extended, the fish sinks. Here we have a bear depicted in a field of flowers in the background, and the belly of the bear is fitted with a pressure sensor. When stroked, the belly vibrates. And here is a firefly, depicted by the nocturnal habitation of the firefly, a more night sky, and the belly of the firefly is fitted with a photosensor and an LED. So when a child brings the hand closer to the LED, therefore covering the photosensor next to it, it lightens up the LEDs on the opposite page. Now you know our textile prototype, and here's an overview of our study and methods. So we conducted our user study with 18 children, and between the age of 1 to 7, along with their parent or a grandparent. And involving children over 3 years was done to contrast their reactions and behavior of our intended user group. The interaction session was video recorded, followed by an interview. So what was the most interesting moment for us was the unintended interactions. For example, as you can see here, we have a child that uses his foot and his hand to try to interact with the whole book. And we also noted that many children during the interaction session tried to dismantle the book. So you can see that here. And why they did this? Just out of curiosity. So another example is where a child brought her favorite toy with her to play with the book. So this was a lot of unintended interactions that we did not really expect in our study.
Yeah, and after having analyzed this user study, we then conducted 3 expert interviews, as already said. We wanted to discuss the result on the background of an expert's perspective of how developmental psychology and media usage could actually go hand in hand. For that, we designed a semi-structured interview guide with open questions ranging from early development over media usage to what toys and playing actually means for a child. So we were able to interview finally a professor of cognitive development and cognitive psychology and early development, an expert for early media usage and video gaming, and a professional in education who was director in Waldorf Kindergarten. All interviews, each interview lasted around 45 minutes. In parallel to these expert interviews, we conducted a focus group session with parents. The 6 participants had children that were aged between 4 months to 8 years. And the goal of this focus group was to gain a better understanding what actually does it mean, how children play, what parents actually expect from such an e-text type book, and to reflect our results on the parental perspective. The session lasted 2 hours, and it was a mix between discussions on our research and our designs and activities where the parents got more creative concerning and created book stories for maybe the next version of the prototype. As a result, we were able to phrase a few design recommendations which follow now. So what is the characteristics of the interactions that we shall implement for this very young age group? At first, we argue for one-step and age-appropriate interactions. What does it mean? So the test uses under 3 fully engaged with the simple characters of the interactive book that we provided, whereas the older ones were quickly bored and demanded more complex stories from such a book. So infants have a limited attention span and memory ability. That's why one action should follow or should trigger one effect without much delay at the end. Further, children do not easily discover new actions. For instance, pulling the fish's tail in our study was not discovered by the youngest at all. So they are usually used on a flat surface to mainly press something, not pull something. So that's why they didn't discover it. And at the end, this means that interaction needs to be easy to perform for the relevant age group. It needs to be age appropriate. Next, the featured interactions should guide the child's entertainment and provide variability in input and output modalities. That means the interaction should not get boring, but keep the child entertained and curious in a certain way. For instance, our test users from all age groups started disassembling the book at a certain point, and after having discovered everything. So we should guide the child's attention away from seams and fasteners in this case. Further, our test users often tended to explore the book with their whole body. Discussing this unintended interaction with experts and parents revealed that children not yet use a book as we adults are used to use a book, so sitting down and looking at it. That's why a toy should inherently train motor skills and provide diverse ways of interaction. In addition, what digital effects should the smart toy provide for the youngest people?
So for digital effects, the textbook or a toy should subtly enhance the interactions that children are already familiar with. Therefore, the effects should not be flashy, noisy, or be annoying, but rather calming and relaxing. And also the digital effects should be very diverse. So a positive example from our prototype was the firefly. It attracts the child's attention through this one small LED light on its lower body. And when touching it, the stars on the opposite page brighten up and not getting too bright. The next is where young children seek the feeling of security and familiarity. Therefore, a black box effect should be avoided. So interactions and effects need to be as transparent as possible, and the child should not be confused. A very good example from our own prototype where some infants were confused was by our singing fish.
Singing, yeah. And finally, how should we design an e-text type book or a smart soft toy in general for the under 3-year-old?
So we need a suitable and developmental supportive book that allow for whole body interactions and as well as shared interaction or shared experience. So our study showed that children of all age groups explored the book with their full body and they also cuddle the book. And almost all children involved their parents in this play session.
We uncovered a number of requirements for toddlers for easy stories and addressing all senses, such as brief stories and short interactions where everything is explained in just a sentence or an image. And the design and the story should always address all senses using different materials or invite touch and interaction. And the last is parents are also our stakeholders. Therefore, we must design books keeping them and addressing their needs as well, such as having toys that is calming, materials that is washable, robust, and having very low voltage electronics, therefore prioritizing e-textiles.
Thank you for your attention. Please read our article if you're interested in more details, or write us if you are interested in further information. And for now, we are happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Hi. Michael Amar, University of Siegen in Germany. Because of social constructions in our society, technology is considered to be more of a boys thing. So did you see any gendered differences in your study, and do you think that your technology can be a game changer here for access to girls?
This main study that we did was not about the gender equality of thinking what toys we take for each gender. It was more on the focus of what kind of interactions can we introduce to them at an early age. That was more our focus, and we wanted to show that we have something outside of smartphones and tablets that children can actually use and learn certain interactions and enhance their developmental skills, like the motor skills, and start at the early stage of cognitive development. This was more our focus rather than the gender study, so to say.
Okay, no, I was just interested.
But you are right in general, and this actually could already introduce gender towards female or male, and it's up to us as designers and researchers to either prevent or to support this path, so like the industry does. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, okay.
Hi, Jared Duval, UC Santa Cruz. Great talk. I also have found that children love destroying the things that we make and the tangibles, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how we might design it so they also want to fix it after they destroy it.
We had we had an interesting discussion on that in our parental focus group, where it was a daddy who is a tinkerer by himself. And we came up with story ideas to actually support children in creating something. So instead of disassembling, doing it the other way around. But we all agreed on it that the under 3-year-olds don't really get the concept at all. So it's at this age not yet a question to engage them to put things together. It's more for the older age groups, I agree, but for the younger, it's just the point that we need to prevent them from disassembling it, because it could get dangerous if they reach the technology. Yeah.
Adrian Schneider, Queen's University in Canada. I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier on that, I can't remember your exact wording, but it was something like experts recommend that children not be using any digital devices at all before the age of 4. Why is that?
It's difficult. They leave it kind of open. For instance, there is a framework on designing tangible devices for children by Antler. I think it was published in 2007, if you might know it. And she addresses only children that are older than 3. One point is the cognitive development at that stage, because it's different, and it's quite different before or under 3. Under 4 or 3, it's, you don't have a real cut at the age. I lost my path. Could you repeat your question?
I was wondering, is there a reason experts say digital devices are terrible for young children, like it'll explode their brains?
And actually, all experts who are addressing digital technologies for children always say we don't address the under 3 years old or the under 4 years old, but don't give a real reason for that. And this is something we want to explore as well. So this is one. yeah, we didn't find an answer yet.
And also from the study from 2015, what we just mentioned, they said that children given under 3 years old a smartphone, they freeze looking at the screen. They don't really move around. And that's very, very untypical for a child to not move around. They freeze looking at the phone, and it's just the fingers that move. And normally a child should be still when sleeping, but when looking at a digital smart device, for example, a smartphone or a tablet, they freeze in that situation, and they are so into the whole smartphone that they forget the whole movement.
So this is an answer by a cognitive psychologist, for instance, who says never hand over technologies that keep them away from moving their body, because this is important for their sensory emotional development at this age. So it's not fully clear, but thanks for the question.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks again.
And the next talk will be an analysis of longitudinal trends in consumer thoughts on presence and simulator signals in VR games, presented by John Porter.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning. My name is John Porter III. I'm under Dr. Andrew Robb at Clemson University, and today I'll be presenting an analysis of longitudinal trends in consumer thoughts on presence and simulator signals in VR games. It's a long thing, it's a long title, but don't worry. So, the television, the radio, movies, the cell phone, and the console. What do all of these pictures have in common? One, they are the initial infant versions of themselves. Two, they are somehow globally entwined within our everyday lives. And three, they're all used for some sort of social or gaming interaction. So our question was, does VR fit these other criteria? Who thinks so? So our research question is, in terms of research perceptions, as users have become more accustomed to consumer VR now that it's been released to the general public, what longitudinal trends are we seeing, and how are they changing over time? To answer this, we used Reddit, which I found out yesterday a lot of other people are using it for research, so I'm very excited. So for those of you who aren't sure what Reddit is, it's a very popular social discussion site, website, ranked very highly, both in the US and worldwide. Has a large amount of users and active communities where people can have conversations about different topics that they're very interested in. The one we chose to select our research focus on is the R Vive. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a Vive is, it is a VR headset, one of the more popular ones that was released in April 2016, which is when we began our Reddit post search, all the way to 2 years after. We selected the Vive because of all the different affordances it had and how popular it was based on other VR headsets at the time. During our search, we chose 3 topics to look into. VR sickness, which is the virtual reality version of motion sickness, and immersion and presence. For the sake of time and also because of the themes that we found that were correlated, immersion and presence will be reduced into just one topic. So we chose VR sickness because it is pretty much what we found to be what makes VR not enjoyable for players as compared to other consoles that they can play, because obviously it makes people sick. And it usually happens because players can see movement, but since they aren't experiencing movement, they suffer some type of physiological sickness. Presence and immersion is the opposite. We found that it is what makes VR more enjoyable than maybe some other consoles because of all the different things you can do and how it makes you feel when you're in a VR headset compared to playing things on a screen. So all the data collection, we had a large amount of Reddit posts that we read through to get through all these topics through that 2 years. So we were only able to sample them for every 3 months that we could try to collect an accurate amount of longitudinal data. In that 3 month interval, we read about an average of 30 posts per topic, so that's 3 topics, equaling to about 800 posts, a little over 800 posts, all with comments ranging in each post anywhere between 1 to 300. So it's a lot of little comments in all the posts. And as we read posts, they were constantly compared and coded to, using thematic content analysis to strengthen our major themes and subthemes. All right, so without further ado, let's get into the data we found. For the sake of time, because I have 2 years worth of data, I just split it into early post and later post. The early post is about the things that we found within the first year or so, and then the later post is about the things we found in the second year. So in regards to presence, one of the major things we found in the early post is hardware affordances can lay the foundation for presence, both positively and negatively. So with vertical FOV, motion controls, these are things that the Vive itself has over other headsets that made presence more, increase presence more for players over time. Whereas having missing frame rates, flickering or dead pixels, and just the general dislike of the lens at the time reduce the presence. So depending on what type of hardware you're using can greatly affect the user's presence. Even though the negative things, most users did agree that it was self-made error from improper settings. The other thing we found was that looks aren't everything, but failed expectations are. So if a user sees your game, they don't really care as much if it's realistic or very fancy and graphically sound, but more concerned of if things work the way they intend to work. So if everything looks nice, but if the things are not working like they think it should in that world, then that's when players lose presence dramatically. So for example, Minecraft. It doesn't look realistic, but players enjoy it because it actually works the way they feel it should. In the later posts, this is extended where users felt not just that things in the world should work as they should, but also the interactions themselves. So if a player tries to pick up something or something drops to the floor and ends up going through the floor, that'll dramatically pull them out of the feeling of presence in the game because the things that they're trying to interact with are also not working as they should. And this also extends to having important signifiers because if players have to guess and figure out things that they can and can't interact with, it will also greatly reduce their presence. I know I'm talking more negatively about things that will reduce presence, but if you follow these things, then it'll actually increase it more so, or at least keep it level if they're already feeling it. So let's go back in time to early posts again from the view of motion sickness. We found that users often wondered why were they experiencing motion sickness? How did they stop motion sickness? Where are they coming from? And the users' discussion that we found came to 3 things in the end. One, they blamed the developers because some of the developers were moving the player's point of view around without the player's consent, which made them considerably sick. 2, self-made error. They realized that some of them just weren't following the instructions that came with the Vive when they opened it. So they weren't actually setting it up properly, which sometimes caused motion sickness. And 3, most agreed that it's just something, a part of life. People just get in VR, they get motion sick because maybe you need to practice more and then eventually you won't have motion sickness anymore. And the other major thing in motion sickness in the early posts was the large amount of debate over what type of locomotion technique should be allowed. In the beginning, it was always teleportation, where users were actually very comfortable with teleportation because it made less people sick. But as we saw over time, people started to get more upset with that because they felt they were limited. So there was a large amount of debate that rose over time. In the later posts, we found that users actually became more mature in their understanding of motion sickness and eventually understood that it's just better to give more options to the users. So if they have more options of different locomotion techniques they can use, it makes everyone happy because some people enjoy teleportation while some enjoy other forms of locomotion movements and such. Where some people can get sick and some people don't, and it's just as simple as that. And finally, in the later posts, we actually noticed that users were becoming an active part of the solution to motion sickness, where they were helping to advise other users in the post discussions about how they got motion sickness and how they were able to overcome it and the like. Also offering suggestions to developers on how to help improve the current locomotion techniques so that it can expand to a broader audience. So my takeaway points for things that the developers should try to consider when making VR games would be one, that although novice users can and will adapt to the new hardware and software, they will be excited about the nuances of VR, but eventually that'll wear off. Where they are like children. You start in VR, everything seems really flashy and interesting, but as you get accustomed to it, the flash wears off, and now they want to get more to the nitty-gritty of interactions and more important topics. So just be aware. One of the most important things I can say is that clear signifiers and expected outcomes can greatly impact presence and acceptance of your game. If players can't easily find out or figure out what they can and can't interact with, and things aren't working as what they expected should, it'll immediately impact their presence, and they may just get rid of your game and start negatively talking about it to other people. It's best to try to offer as many multiple locomotive options as you possibly can. I know that's a hard thing to try to integrate in the game. Just integrating one is probably enough, but if you can, try to integrate two, just because some people might not like that one, and if you can add more variety in your game, then it's the best for them. And my last is keeping up with these social channels is going to be very beneficial to designers, we think, because in the Reddit posts and maybe some other social areas, it's a good place for developers to find short and long-term design goals, and also to let the users get an insight into where they're currently thinking they're heading with their game. And then the users themselves can let you know things that they feel will be good or bad in the early stages of iteration. That way you can get it fixed before you actually send the game out and get more immediate feedback. And that is it. So I'd like to give a special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Andrew Robb, Clemson University, NSF grant for funding my research, and the Clemson Human Factors Institute for providing my travel. Thank you.
Well, hi. So this is Narcis Paredes from Universitat Pompeu Fabra, so the hosting university. Thank you for your talk. It's interesting, but I was wondering a couple of things. On the one hand, I think it would be useful always that when you post this sort of studies, you make sure that you define head-mounted display-based VR, because virtual reality can have many system configurations, so it can be misleading as to how broad the study is being built. So head-mounted display doesn't actually mean VR, or VR doesn't mean head-mounted display. So just that's like an extra comment. But I was also wondering, have you contrasted all this with other like scientific journals and papers that have been posted on presence and motion sickness? Because Reddit tends to have a lot of people that speak out of the top of their heads. And there's journals such as Presence Teleoperators and Virtual Environments, which have discussed all these topics like broadly since the 90s. And there's a huge amount of literature on that. So for example, with regards to motion sickness, it's quite clear nowadays that it's because of misalignment between different sensory inputs. So for example, having only visual input of motion and not correlating with physical proprioception and kinesthetic perception of motion. So those things are something that we already know, and that I thought it would be interesting to bring up in your study. On the other hand, with respect to presence, I was also a bit surprised that in a context of high play in which we are currently, in which we try to very often make fantastic worlds that are not simulation, that all your analysis of presence is very based on simulation. So if something falls off your hand virtually and it falls through the floor, it seizes your sense of presence. Well, but if that's the way I want to build my fantastic world, because strange things happen, because strange things are fun when we design playful activities, well, where does presence come in that moment? Is it important to have presence? Is it not? But moreover, there are many studies which say that presence should not be linked to simulation. So I would like to know your position about it.
Okay, a lot to unpack. Give me a second. I want to make sure I answer all your questions. The first is you are completely correct. Head-mounted display is not the equivalent of VR. I apologize. I just wanted to make sure that, well, regardless. But the second was presence and motion sickness in the literature as compared to what I found here. The purpose of this paper was to get an idea of how the user and the consumer base is looking at presence and simulator sickness through their lens so that we can have an understanding of, because you're correct, I have read the literature on presence and simulator sickness, and I know that the different nuances of where we're at currently as researchers, but with this is more to find out what the average Joe, the consumer, believes or sees presence and simulator sickness, and getting an understanding of their aspect, because eventually, ultimately we're building these games, we're building it for them. So to get an understanding of where their mindset is as they go into VR, we thought would be very beneficial. Also, there's actually a large amount of researchers and developers and people that do understand the differences between presence and immersion and simulator sickness versus VR sickness in these Reddit posts. So all these Reddit posts aren't just from people that have no idea. There's also a large amount of people that are very experienced in these topics that are having these discussions. And your last question.
Well, no, you've answered it.
Oh.
But actually, what I'm trying to put through is that maybe by addressing these issues in this manner, we're just reinforcing those misconceptions, not only in the people out in the street, the lay people, but also scientists that haven't read all that literature that we have read, right? So I think it would be important to change those perspectives because they're completely wrong, actually.
Yes.
Thank you.
No problem. I'll be around if you have more questions.
Okay, so the next and last talk in the session will be Outstanding, a multi-perspective travel approach for virtual reality games, presented by Sebastian Mintowski.
Mintowski, yes. Thank you. So, I'm Sebastian, I'm from University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and so let me directly continue with where we just left. So, a new travel technique for large distances in virtual reality. And when I say virtual reality, I already mean head-mounted display. So, okay. So let's imagine that putting on your headset and exploring such large and open landscapes freely on your own in virtual reality. Sounds promising. But how do you get from one interesting spot to another? Using positional tracking that comes with most headsets is clearly not enough, since it's limited to your physical play space alone. So what we need is a virtual travel technique. And the most common one is the teleport, which is quite easy, intuitive, and rather precise. But as you see here, the longer the travel gets, it gets quite boring and repetitive. So let's try to find a different approach for such large distances. In this example, we stand on a path that leads to a farmhouse. And instead of directly teleporting there, what we could do now is switching our point of view. So after a short transition, we're now in the scaled third-person perspective. So we can see our avatar that stands on the ground where we left, and we can see the path, and we can see the house. And what we could do now is set a waypoint for our character. So as you see, the avatar directly starts approaching this target at a natural pace, just like we would have walked ourselves. And when he's there, we can then switch back. We could now use the technique to travel even further, or stay in the first person to interact with the world on a natural level. So this is our main idea, switching between different perspectives on demand to simplify navigation over long distances and to achieve a fluent experience experience without any visible cuts or jumps in between. So let's take a look at the details. Most VR games only use a first-person perspective. It provides agency, presence, and it also makes it easy to interact with the world on a very natural level. In contrast, only few developers rely on third-person views. However, this perspective provides an appealing advantage for navigation. So it allows to decouple players and avatar. This makes it possible to move the character freely in the world. The players can observe this locomotion from the outside without getting cybersick. So we combine those two modes together to simplify navigation. But this alone is not enough. So how could we enhance the player's overview so that they can always orient themselves well in the world and know where to go next? Here I want to point to two interesting recent Sakai papers. One by my colleague Andrei, one by Parasio Aptai. And both on a board scale did quite a similar thing. So they scaled the players to giant size so that they could walk longer distances on foot. This also brought up an interesting advantage of player scaling. So elevating the point of view enhances spatial orientation. So that said, it seemed natural for us to integrate this into our approach. But let me mention here, it is not enough to just elevate the player's height alone, because this would produce a cognitive mismatch and again cyber sickness. What we should always do instead is increase the height and eye distance proportionally to avoid such issues. Now, how do we get from the first to the third person? Since we want to eliminate all visible cuts, we went for a gradual transition. But again, as we heard, applying a motion to the player can easily cause cyber sickness. So one has to always keep the transition as short as possible. Also, purely scaling the player vertically alone is not enough. Let's take a look at this situation. Here the players are already in third person, but they have to tilt their head nearly 90 degrees down to see their avatar standing at their feet. Over a longer time, this posture is very uncomfortable. So what we could do instead is moving them slightly backward. Now they could see the avatar much easier. Now the last thing we did to the transition was replacing the linear one with a smooth curve instead. So it started by moving the player backward first before beginning the actual scaling. The resulting difference is very subtle here, but again makes the whole experience even more fluent and natural. So let's take a look at the final result. So now we can assemble all three main components together. Adding the third-person perspective to decouple player and avatar, using scaling to enhance overview, and transitioning smoothly between both states to achieve a fluent experience. Now it's also interesting to see what players think of this idea. So we did an in-between study to compare it with a standard teleport. And therefore, we placed the participants in a very large open world and had them follow a 2-kilometer long path where they had to pick up items at designated spots. Afterwards, they described their experiences in various questionnaires. So let's take a look at the results. The first good news is no one had any issues with cyber sickness in none of the groups. Also, we could observe a significantly improved spatial orientation. That itself is not surprising since it confirms the results from previous papers. But players also mentioned they needed much shorter times to reorient themselves after each relocation. So maybe here the animated transition between both modes helped them to understand this movement. Also, participants that used our approach played on average 60 minutes, which is 66% longer than those using teleports. And this is mostly due to the avatar walking at a natural pace instead of teleporting. Now, this wasn't perceived negative by the players. If we take a look at the rather high results from the presence and enjoyment questionnaires, we see almost equal values among both groups. So Despite a much longer playtime, both groups had pretty similar experiences. All in all, players liked using multiple perspectives for long travels. Here they could use very far and few waypoints to travel with minimal effort. However, if you only observe shorter distances, the overhead of switching perspectives first before beginning the actual travel provided an overhead that wasn't perceived that good. So here, most participants would have preferred an additional fallback technique to use for short distances, like the teleport. Now, I've talked already a lot about traveling and navigation, but using multiple perspectives could be useful for more than this purpose alone. So let's take a look at some other use cases. So, what abilities do players currently have in third person? Currently, that's mainly only setting waypoints and exploring the world. But why should we stop here? Instead, we could see those two views as two distinct gameplay modes with completely different abilities. For example, we could give the players superpowers in third person, like living heavy obstacles that block the path. Also, which perspective is the dominant one? Are we playing in first person and switch to giant mode from time to time, or is it the other way around? Think of a strategy game where we explore a very large world. If there's an encounter, we could then switch to a first person perspective temporarily and afterwards back. And a final idea, maybe we could use those multiple perspectives to control more than a character in VR at a time. So in third person, it's easy to command a whole squad, for example. Only when we then switch to first person, we would have to choose one NPC. These are only 3 possible use cases for using multiple perspectives in virtual reality. And I think that there are probably many more. Maybe you have already some own ideas where to use such a technique. So with this, I'm finished, and I'd be happy to discuss this with you further and now answer any questions you might have. Thanks for listening.
Hi, Dimitri from Bremen. I was wondering if this transition between perspectives has an effect on the connection, let's say, between the player and the avatar.
Yeah, we thought so too, but it turned really out. So we did semi-structured interviews and stuff, and players told us that in third person they perceive the avatar more like a tiny character you have to guard on your way. So it's not like you're in third person and you're feeling still connected that this is your avatar. It's more like an NPC you are controlling. So it's completely decoupled. This is also maybe quite useful for you controlling the multiple characters at once, because if you don't have such a strong connection to one NPC, you just embody them when switching to first person.
Yeah. Hi. Here. Sebastian. Yeah. Guillermo from the University of Hanover in Germany. Thank you for your presentation. It's nice that you didn't get any simulator sickness in your participants, but I was wondering if maybe they reported some kind of fear for heights or something like that, because just looking at the whole landscape from above, I think that would be maybe scary.
Honestly, we didn't assess it, but have you ever been to Legoland? You don't have fear of heights in Legoland, so this is really the impression when you scale the plane as a whole, also scaling the eye distance. It's really a miniature world, so that's just a tiny character that you control there, and you don't have any feeling of really being like 200 meters tall. So I presume there was no fear of heights. At least players didn't mention anything like that.
Hi, a really nice presentation. Elena Marquez Segura, Uppsala University. I was wondering about, like, I saw that you had like all these design considerations when you were designing this transition, right? Like you go back and then up so that it goes smooth and you don't get any kind of fire signals or like strong negative reaction. I was wondering first about the other transition. Once your character gets there, like have you also considered different trajectories to get to that person? That's one of the questions. And then the other one, when you showed the video of the character walking, for some reason I expected in this kind of God mode to be also following a bit that avatar instead of being, behind. Because also if you're in that perspective, you wouldn't have to travel that much, right? Like it would, like distances could be short. So I was wondering if you thought about that, if you tested that.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. So the first thing with the transition, so we did not differ between different distances, but we did a pre-study to fine-tune the transition, and the transition is very short, so it's only half a second. But we tested different approaches, different trajectories, and the curve felt a bit smoother than the linear one. But there's no real difference between the different distances here. It's just maybe that we're approaching the character's head from the behind, so it's more like embodying. And considering your second question, this is exactly what produced cyber sickness. So staying with the character and just following on behind would produce a lengthy animated motion, which would produce cyber sickness. So by decoupling them, yeah, even on in big scale. So by decoupling them, it's completely unprogrammable. And just for reference, in our pre-studies we had an additional technique to catch up on the avatar, basically just a forward movement to catch up the distance, basically like switching back and forth, only in a linear transition. And if some players overuse this, so they use it constantly, and they really got cyber sick. So for our main study, we used this and we cut this feature off because we didn't want anyone to get cyber sick. We wanted to test this technique alone. But yeah, I think this is demonstrating the answer. It's probably not the best way here. Yeah, please catch me up afterwards.
Thank you. So I think that was the last talk for the session, and I think the next thing is lunchtime until 2. Thank you, everyone.